patient and pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, we've gathered on an extraordinary day. It's St. Herman Day, and of course we knew all of you would be free. And our intention was twofold. One, that we could gather in prayer, but two, so that you wouldn't be distracted by another celebration and have other thoughts. So today here we are standing before St. Herman and St. Spiridon, and we look for something that feeds our souls. And we look to the Word of God. It was just read. And so now we speak a little bit about that Word of God and also of our saint. For the two of them, it's like a collusion. They work together and they bring something for us. Now, that's better than going to the mall. And it's better than even the tree with its lights. Here we are, and we look at St. Herman. If you don't know about him, we'll say a few words. First of all, how do we relate to him in terms of our feeling for history? The first thing we could say is he was born about the time of the American Revolution. And when he died, America was involved in a war with Mexico about that time. So you get a feeling for when he lived. He's antique by our modern standards, and yet there's this timelessness, which is why we have the celebration today. Now, St. Herman was a monk. He wasn't a priest monk, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't ordained to any level. But he came from that special ladder or chain of spirituality that's always present in Orthodoxy. Look for it always. If you read the life of someone who impresses you, usually there's a forebear. There's someone who came before them, someone who shared something of that chain of grace that goes back all the way to Christ. And in St. Herman's case, there was a man who is, if you listen carefully, he was in that famous monastery of Sarov, where we know of St. Seraphim, whose icon is here. See, the chain was already beginning. So Herman, not even being a priest, could carry a spirituality that was valuable. And he started, for all intents and purposes, in a very bleak place. Well, we can look out the window and get a feeling for it. He started in a bleak place called Valam, but within that place, as typical of places of grace, there was a great deal of warmth. He lived already on his own, which means that he had attained a fair degree of spiritual perfection, and the abbot of the monastery was asked to send some missionaries to the New World. It had been discovered by Russians about a decade before this request was made, and Herman was one of those chosen. He was sent across a huge stretch of land. One needs to look at a map to see how far one has to travel to go from where Valam was, which isn't too far from modern St. Petersburg, and go all the way across the Russian Empire, and even further, across an ocean where fully a third of the shipping was lost routinely, and make it all the way to the new land and settle on what was in Kodiak, where this area was Kodiak, and eventually, of course, the name of Spruce Island, an island about 2 miles away. What did Herman do in all that time? Well, he had lives not as different as from ours, even though he's antique. He had a life of struggles. He had people he had to deal with. We've had some confessions lately. We all know about this. You have people you deal with. He had to deal with people. Many of them weren't very strongly committed to belief. And they were Russians. They were administrators. Their job in Alaska, what's now called Alaska, their job was to make money. They harvested skins from animals, and they wished to make as much money as they could. And they used the natives as their workforce. St. Herman frequently found him in a position defending those natives, what we would call, in modern parlance, he was concerned about their rights, their human rights, their humanity. It goes farther, it goes deeper. Eventually, in a quiet way, and this is so typical of this sort of spirituality, in a very quiet way, he had his disciples, and he had some orphans. He had disciples both among males and females, and eventually he reposed, circled to a small degree by some of those disciples. None of the panoply, none of the glory that we're feeling in last night's or today's service. It was very quiet. His cell simple as anything. He wore a piece of deer skin, and he covered his bed with a piece of deer skin. It was a board. And he had 2 bricks for his pillows, just like you read in the lives of the saints. Here he is. He's the continuity that we always look for in the saints. Here it was in full form. And in that simplicity, he made a number of prophecies before he died. He had contact with a number of people who said that that contact established memories that they were the most precious possession all of their lives, either through letters or personal reminiscences. He wasn't even buried officially by the church for many days. He lay in state among his disciples in a quiet way. And finally, because the authorities couldn't get there, his natives buried him. What happened then after that? Nothing. He was forgotten. Even Balaam had lost touch with him. And a number of decades passed, and it wasn't God's will that he be forgotten. And he was remembered. There was eventually an abbot in his first monastery of Balaam, and that abbot started to collect the materials. And it led eventually, and through many decades, and through many travels and many cultures, it came to us in 1970, the celebration of his glorification, where the church recognized his saintliness. Now, of course, we take it almost for granted. Here he is, one of our saints, an American saint, American who, not American like modern Americans, but a man who carried that treasure of Russian spirituality, the Russian Orthodox spirituality, to a new place and established it well. Now, what does this have to do with the gospel reading today and the epistle reading? If you're very familiar with our services, you realize that there was a pair of readings today. St. Paul's epistle and the gospel from Luke. They are something that you re-encounter frequently, and you realize, oh, these are the readings we do when we have a great saint. And we heard the Gospel of Luke, and it explained the Beatitudes. And remember, the Beatitudes we call the Sermon on the Mount, and the fullest form of those would be in the Gospel of Matthew, but there's also a mirror image, almost, in the Gospel of Luke, and that was read today. Now, what is it then that we see in those Beatitudes that relates to St. Herman? Why is it that the church repeats this pair of readings all the time in relation to the saint? Well, in this case, because we are already within that 2-week period, that 2-week window that leads us to the celebration of Nativity, we should say a few words about Nativity. Here we are in our replacement for the Western version. Here we are standing. We might as well say something about the Nativity we're still looking forward to. In the understanding of the Church, we celebrate something called the Incarnation. The Incarnation means taking a physical form. And when the Lord came, all the fathers of the Church say this was the one moment in history that was truly new. In other words, before there were men in struggles, there had been paradise, and after Christ there were still men in struggles. But this appearance of the man, it was also God, was something completely novel. Now, what was this man? Well, the Church has a word for it, not just the Incarnation. They call him the new Adam. And you'll hear this theme all the way up through Passion Week and into Pascha. The new Adam. Why do we call him the new Adam? Because he was something that fixed what the old Adam did. What did the old Adam do? He did 2 things. To really simplify it. He sinned, and he introduced mortality. In other words, death. He brought death to the human race. And for this, he was expelled from paradise. What did the new Adam do? Exactly the reverse. He was sinless, and he was immortal. And he took that immortality down to Hades. This is like Pascha, isn't it? And he takes it down to Hades, and he shatters the power of death. These are wonderful ideas. What does it have to do with St. Herman? Well, that's the interesting point. We would like to have some sort of idea of blandishment. In other words, a nice idea that swirls around and we're smiling all the time. And yet when we hear the Gospel from Luke and we hear about his struggles, because he did struggle. He hungered, he had tears, he slept on his bricks, he was persecuted, certainly by his fellow Russians, his fellow Orthodox. All of those things that you hear in the Beatitudes, if you look carefully enough at his life, there they were, in Herman. Why is it then that the new Adam could come and abolish sin or do something about the sin of Adam and do something about mortality. Why is it that Herman had to live the life of the Beatitudes? And that's the great, wonderful thing. This idea of being cast out of paradise is still with us. In other words, when Adam had to leave paradise, he still could die, and we, his inheritors, could also face the same problem. We still also have to die. What then is it that Pascha and this incarnation of Christ begins? What is it that it offers? It offers us a step into the realm of eternity. In other words, yes, the body still dies, but the bridge of grace, because Christ joined with us in our physical form, the bridge of grace allows us, with those struggles listed in the Beatitudes, the bridge of grace allows us to walk from here, the valley of the shadow of death, into the realm of blessedness. That's what the incarnation is. It's not an illumination, otherwise Luke wouldn't have had to write what he wrote down about the Sermon on the Mount. It's not an elimination of struggle, which is why we continue to struggle to this day. We have our fast right now, we had our service last night where we stand, we have the long preparation, and yet, as with St. Herman, there's that embracing of the light, that reversal of the darkness that began with Adam, and in that embracing of light, we now picture, well, Spiridon too, he was the same cloth, he pictured with this light around them. Why? Because through that path, remember the Lord also had his struggles, remember the cross, through those paths, these same men went the path of the Lord into the path of eternity. Amen. Let us